Look, no intro is actually the best intro. Thumbs up if you agree. Let's start the first benchmark with field of view. There's a couple of common online claims that have spread widely, which say that FPS is highest at an FOV of 90. Maybe this was true around launch, but it's not today. As you can see, the higher the FOV, the lower the FPS. The game does lower the level of detail as they appear further and further from us as a result of a higher FOV. This is why the FPS loss isn't as big as you'd expect from this setting, totaling only about a 4 to 6% FPS loss from 60 all the way to 120. This is one of the more subjective settings because unlike most settings, it's not about balancing performance and visuals. It's more about personal preference. Having said that, I'll include the results here without a recommendation, but we'll say that an FOV of 103 is a very popular choice among pro players. Alright, let's start from the top with streaming quality. This setting can only be toggled before entering a battle royale. This setting decides whether very rarely used textures should be preloaded into your video RAM or not. Benchmarking it can be quite difficult since it requires starting the match with the exact same airplane path, as well as having the exact same pre-game warm-up location, and of course following the same route in-game. Nevertheless, here we are, and as expected, we notice significantly less video RAM used with the setting turned to low. How much VRAM you save by turning this to low will depend on the areas you visit on the map. This is a great time to mention that many online sources say this setting affects the distance that textures are loaded in. But as you can see here, this is not the case. Taking a look at the FPS, we notice no significant performance differences since the only difference here is VRAM use. Unless your video card has a vast amount of VRAM, which you'll see shortly means about 12 GB or more, the recommendation for this setting is low. Since there is no significant FPS drop, you won't be seeing textures load any slower, and most importantly, we save a ton of VRAM space, which is particularly critical in this game. This now brings me to a very important topic which we need to cover before we continue. In Warzone, VRAM is considered full at 95% usage. In the simplest of terms, when you reach 95% VRAM usage, your game's performance will suffer and FPS will begin to drop sharply the more insufficient VRAM becomes. Since Warzone can easily eat up well over 10 GB of VRAM, it is the reason for poor performance for many players, which is why it's critical that we keep VRAM usage below 95%. Unfortunately, the VRAM bar you see here is estimated rather badly, since I'm able to easily max out the 10 GB card even when it's set well below the max line. You'll see the scenario in action on the next setting, Texture Resolution, which has the highest use of VRAM of any setting. Notice as we turn the setting higher and higher, the estimated VRAM goes up exponentially. From afar, we notice a huge difference between very low and low, with very slight improvement beyond that. The high quality texture really only becomes noticeable when we are standing very close. Okay, so we have a huge visual improvement from very low to low on the ground texture and the bus texture. The VRAM cost is hefty, but at little cost to our frame rate performance. Normal gives a little more visual improvement to the bus at the cost of more VRAM and a few more frames. The high setting is particularly disappointing, with barely noticeable visual improvement and a significant drop in VRAM and frame rate. This time, it's not just due to reaching the VRAM bottleneck. The high setting here always carries a large performance drop for this particular setting. Character textures are improved from low to normal, although we might have to pause and probably even zoom in for this to be noticeable. Low to normal is also where the road and some ground textures are improved. Both of these two improved textures will only be noticeable up to about this distance. Your overpriced weapon skins improve from very low to low, but not above that. The gloves, however, improve from very low all the way through to normal. Put it all together, and without the pause, these are all really quite subtle. What isn't subtle is that huge FPS drop approaching a 20% loss on very high. I want you to pay attention to the very high setting during this benchmark and see what happens to the VRAM as you explore the map. Now, not to boss your eyes around, but if you pay attention to this building, we see a not so subtle effect where very low and low are particularly late to load the building textures. Well, back to the settings page, we have an easy decision here. The FPS loss for low and normal are not big, but high is rather ridiculous at almost 20%. And given that the benefits gained on high are very small, it's a no-brainer that normal is the sweet spot here for visuals and performance. That is, of course, as long as you have a video card with enough VRAM to support it. Up next, we have the oddly named Texture Filter Anisotropic, also known as anisotropic filtering in any other game. This setting simply dictates at what distance textures should be rendered to full resolution. It doesn't apply to this particular floor, but it does to the walls here. Since it's also subtle, we can bring up the magnifying glass once again. This setting won't affect your VRAM either, since the textures are loaded regardless. It only changes the distance at which they are rendered to full resolution. Some floors are affected by this setting, and this is the best way to see the distance to which each setting will render high-res textures. Although it's a little hard to notice on the high setting, keep in mind it's a lot more noticeable on resolutions above 1080p. There is no significant FPS difference either on any of my test benches for anisotropic filtering. When I say this, by the way, I'm referring to my 3 test benches, which consist of an RTX 3080, a 2070, and a GTX 1060. Bench setup details are in the description below, along with recommendations if you're looking to upgrade. We recommend a setting of high, since there is no performance loss as long as your video card isn't a decade old. Think of this one as a free visual upgrade. Moving on, we have particle quality. This one is incredibly interesting since most online sources completely miss everything important about it, such as the fact it greatly improves visibility. But to be thorough, we will start off with the well-known and useless effect it applies to sparks. Literally, it makes the little sparks slightly smaller and sharper. And yes, this effect does apply to grenades and explosions as well. Although, unless you're Neo from the Matrix, you would never notice. So here it is again in slow motion. The only time you might truly notice this effect would be on the main screen if you happen to have this backdrop. Now, the effect that actually matters from particle quality is a shimmering effect when the background is either the poison circle, smoke, or certain types of clouds. The sky, however, does not create this effect. This shimmering effect simply reduces vision of any object in front of such a backdrop. More importantly, this effect also applies to our vision of other players. Zooming in on our friend here, Chupapi, we notice our vision of him is obscured. Even at this medium distance, his weapon almost completely disappears, and the edges of his body begin to fade. FPS impact is generally insignificant, although on the RTX 2070 and 3080, I did at times get a 1% increase on the high setting. So we strongly recommend a high for this setting as it greatly improves our vision at times and sometimes even performance. It's a true win-win situation. It completely boggles my mind that some online sources were recommending to actually turn this setting off purely based on the fire spark effect and an assumption that it must have a negative performance impact. But I'll stop comparing to them before it becomes apparent I have an addiction to comparing everything. Next on the list is bullet impact and spray. Let's start by busting the myth that this setting helps you see where a bullet lands at long distances. It does not. The dust produced by the impact happens independently of this setting, and unless you're running 4K or 8K res, you certainly can't see this tiny bullet hole. Other surfaces will produce sparks on impact as seen here, but this is also visible on both settings. Bullet impact affects only the actual bullet hole texture, which are only visible at short distances where bullet drop isn't really of a concern. Looking at the performance impact, it is negligible. However, this will not be the case if your renderer worker count isn't adjusted correctly for your CPU. Now, before we examine what renderer worker count actually is and does, let's watch a clip of where it's set to its default value. Since bullet marks is often a CPU heavy setting, you'll notice the CPU usage spikes and it negatively affects the FPS. That's because Warzone actually allows us to control how much of the setting relies on the CPU. Okay, so what is renderer worker count anyway, and what role does it play in all of this? Well, it's an ini file and you'll find it at this location. If you open the file in Notepad, you will be able to adjust the render worker count. By default, it's usually set to the same number as you have logical CPU cores, although this isn't always the case. Now, contrary to every online, this setting does not change how many CPU cores the game uses. We can easily verify that the game uses all cores. It does, however, change how much the game relies on all of your CPU cores for its processing needs, effectively increasing or decreasing the overall CPU usage. On my i7-7700, which is a 4-core with 8 threads test bench, setting the renderer worker count to 4 keeps CPU usage consistently near or at 100%. This is what being CPU bottlenecked looks like. Reducing the renderer worker count by 1 reduces CPU load by just enough to keep the graph below 100%. By the way, the more these spikes are trying to reach above 100%, the more micro-stuttering, hitching, and lag you'll experience. Alright, let's look at a benchmark for this. For a value of 3, the GPU usage shows that the GPU is now being utilized considerably more now that the CPU isn't bottlenecked anymore, and the FPS increases rather dramatically. At a count of 2, we overshoot that sweet spot of using the hardware to its peak performance. The best setting for the vast majority of players here will be 1 less than your total amount of CPU cores, as long as you don't have CPU intensive apps in the background, such as if you're streaming, have a collection of Google Chrome windows open, or you're just someone that enjoys having an overall bloated Windows. If you want to verify this is the right choice for your particular CPU or setup, you can just go to Start, Task Manager, Performance, CPU. Now you're going to right click on the graph and select Change Graph to Logical Processors. And now you can monitor the CPU use per core for the last 60 seconds. If CPU use is sitting at 100% on any core, you are losing frames due to it. Just keep turning renderer worker count down by 1 until your first core is not constantly flirting with 100%. Remember, you need to restart the game for a change in this ini file to take effect. While we're here, let's take a look at my higher end 11900K, which is an 8-core 16-thread test bench. You'll notice setting it to 8 keeps the first core at 100%. This is what we want to avoid, as it's costing us some heavy frames. At 6, we're looking really good, with spikes hitting 100% barely. This is actually the ideal situation, using our hardware to its peak performance. But since we're here on the desktop, and I know, as always, there will be a few comments about the Activate Windows logo, I have to have this logo for benchmarking purposes, but you don't have to, since it just so happens I'm friends with keysoff.com, a website that sells Windows 10 CD keys for like $15, and they've agreed to give my subscribers 45% off on that, so literally you guys can have a copy of Windows 10 for like $8.00. Check the video description below for the discount code. I'll also include a 58% discount code for Microsoft Office. Enjoy. The final FPS results for bullet impact and sprays is going to be less than 1%, but that is assuming that your CPU is not bottlenecking and your renderer worker count is set correctly for your setup. If you don't like fine-tuning this stuff yourself, just set it to 3 for a 4-core or 6 for an 8-core. And if you experience any stuttering, lower it further. Bullet impact and spray recommendation will be disabled because the bullet holes really don't help us at all. And keeping CPU usage down is kind of a big deal in Warzone. Alright, let's move on to Tesselation. Don't be fooled by this picture. In Warzone, you'll have an extremely hard time finding a texture that actually gets an upgrade from this setting. Trust me, it took over 20 scenes to find only 2 that actually have a Tesselation upgrade, and I generally know where to look. This is one of them, and even if I point it out up close, it's still difficult to notice the difference. Unless we flip between the benchmarks like so. If you're wondering why they even bothered including this setting, it's because Tesselation can make a big difference in other Call of Duty modes, but in Battle Royale, they've actually been removing Tesselation. The result today is that performance impact is negligible and the visual difference is, well, kind of pathetic. So the recommendation here will be disabled because there's nothing to achieve and there is VRAM to be gained. Moving on down, we have on-demand texture streaming. This setting will only have a visual difference if texture resolution is set to high. Those high resolution textures don't come with the initial game install. These huge textures are what causes the insanely high VRAM use on the texture resolution high setting. If you remember, the graphics didn't improve much unless you were really close, and not to our surprise, it severely gobbled up our precious VRAM. Thus, the recommendation here is to set this one to disabled from the moment you install Warzone, because you'll also save some hard drive space. Under shadow and lighting, the first option is shadow map resolution. Contrary to most online sources that guess how this works, the actual FPS goes up the higher you set it. The shadows are blurry on low with fading edges, but this effect is an added filter. The rendering algorithm for this begins with the high setting, which is why the FPS goes down towards the low setting. You're essentially rendering accurate shadows and then adding special effects to them in order to make their edges softer. Quite frankly, the gas price is more interesting than this shadow softening effect. Sometimes the blur effect is more prominent far away. Other times it's more blurry up close. FPS cost can be up to 5% FPS for disabled. Remember, this setting works backwards. Disabled is actually adding additional effects and hurting our performance. During motion, the FPS performance remains the same as the other benchmarks standing still. It's worth noting that during motion, the quality of shadows is rather hard to notice, although it's still there. The final recommendation here will be high instead of extra. The big reason is because VRAM use is particularly high on extra, but also because shadows are unnaturally sharp and distracting on extra as well. Up next is cache spot shadows. This setting will have no graphical difference, since all it does is create a data cache in your VRAM, which it uses to render indoor lights more easily. The result is that it uses more VRAM with the intent to increase FPS. Surprisingly, the FPS difference indoors is almost insignificant, where outdoors the difference becomes about 4%. This is because of the amount of shadows being rendered on the screen, even if they are too far or in a window. I know that's surprising, so here it is again in a different season. Keep in mind, I do run far more of these tests than I include in my final YouTube video to verify these results. The VRAM difference here is usually a couple of 100 megabytes, but this isn't much considering it's an up to 5% FPS gain. So set this one to on if you can spare the 200 megabytes of VRAM. Moving on to cache sun shadows, this setting should be the same as the previous, but should apply only to global illumination, also known as the sun. Again, we notice a minor increase in VRAM use. On the ground, we get a similar FPS increase ranging from 2 to 4%. The highest FPS difference I was able to get was going up high, which increases our view range, and we get a 5 to 6% FPS increase from having this setting enabled. In some games, shadow cache has a bigger impact during motion, but in Warzone I got similar results regardless of speed or even location. Again, we have an FPS increase 2 to 6% at the cost of a couple of 100 megabytes in VRAM. Totally worth it. So set this one to enabled. Jumping down to particle lighting. No joke, everything I've read about this setting online was wrong, and it's due to this false picture over here. I decided the best way to show this would be to find the exact location and recreate this exact scene. And I did find the location over here. Unfortunately, this location is in Grasna Raid of Modern Warfare, which is basically a different game altogether with its own settings. So let's recreate this explosion anyway in Warzone. In case you missed it, here it is frame by frame. There is no FPS difference, and rightly so, since this setting was disabled in Warzone shortly after the game launched, due to its heavy performance impact. You can experience it in Modern Warfare if you so wish, but the recommended setting for this one will be disabled because, well, it's disabled, no matter what. Up next is ray tracing. There is a reason the example picture here is also not taken in Warzone. That's because you cannot take it in Warzone, since there's no ray tracing in Warzone. The setting is likely here just to promote ray tracing supported games, without actually supporting ray tracing. The ray tracing setting doesn't even override screen space reflections, like it does in any other game. But let's be detailed and look at a few benchmarks anyway. To be fair, ray tracing is actually supported in other Call of Duty modes and the campaign, and it does look really good, but I won't show that in this video to avoid any confusion. So, although Call of Duty has ray tracing, having added the setting to the Warzone menu is just misleading. Recommendation will be disabled because setting it to enabled would just trigger my OCD. Hopping one down, we have Ambient Occlusion, which is a shadow technique used to add soft shadows to make the game look more realistic. I want to first point something out. This setting does not add any major shadows to the game, the kind that have clearly defined edges. The reason you may have seen this claim before is because this particular setting you can't just change. You also need to move around a little bit until the settings effects are properly loaded and take effect. Now, what the setting actually does is determine how exposed certain textures are to diffused, non-directional ambient lighting. Notice how the ambient shadows introduced here do not have sharp, clearly defined edges. Think of it as secondary shadows created by darkening parts of a texture, rather than adding light to the surrounding areas the way shadows are traditionally created. Outdoors has the highest impact to our FPS, which ranges from 1% to a 5% FPS drop depending on the location. Unfortunately, outdoors is also where ambient occlusion is the least noticeable. For the most part, it just makes the grass texture slightly darker. Indoors, the performance impact is generally very small, but indoors is also where ambient lighting is more noticeable. Obviously, the ceiling light fixture here stands out, but there's also other subtle changes that become apparent when we flick back and forth between the benches. Dynamic doesn't actually mean moving objects, such as cars, ATVs. They actually still fall under static objects. As a matter of fact, after testing everything I could find that has motion, I was unable to find anything that has an effect from the dynamic setting. And given that other online sources also couldn't find one either, it's safe to say there's likely no dynamic objects that work with ambient occlusion in Warzone. Even the weapon skins are considered static for this setting. So, with that in mind, we recommend disabled because, well, losing frames for some darker shadows is not worth it. Next up, screen space reflections. This adds reflections to surfaces without the use of true ray tracing. Unfortunately, unlike ray tracing, this setting will also introduce a lot of visual noise. The amount will depend on what is being reflected. On disabled, there is no reflections. On low, we get a reflection of the background trees and tower. The car also gains a reflection on normal and high, but the visual noise also becomes distractingly abundant. This is not a glitch, it's just a flaw of screen space reflections technology, and happens in other games too. In Cyberpunk, for example, it was particularly bad. I have a setting benchmark video on that game as well. Essentially, this happens because there isn't enough rays being traced, so the missing pixels information is filled using data from previous frames in which the pixel info was obscured, such as by the motion of the pistol will produce this noise around the pistol. This noise doesn't always happen. It generally only happens when reflecting shadows or certain lighting effects. Regardless, the performance difference from disable to low is almost insignificant. Normal and high carry a hefty 5% FPS decrease, but is also where enemies have a reflection. Personally, I think it's very unlikely you'd notice an enemy's reflection before you actually see him. The recommendation for this one is gonna be off, since it's a competitive game and performance is much more important. Next up, Anti-Aliasing is a bit of a controversial setting for some. The role of anti-aliasing is to increase geometry of objects, which in turn makes them smoother. However, some games like Warzone and Monster Hunter World also employ a cheap trick that just blurs the image as a way to hide the poor polygon count. Having it disabled has edges looking very jagged and flickering. This makes it harder to notice subtle movements in the background and is quite distracting to the eyes. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Filmic T2X. It completely removes the flickering edges and softens the image, but as a result, the image looks very blurry. It's almost fuzzy, which just serves to reduce how well we can see subtle movements at a distance. So the sweet spot is gonna be somewhere in between. The blur is not noticeable on 1x, but the flickering is. On 2x, the blur is slightly visible and the fuzz is also slightly visible. If we freeze the game, disabled looks crisp and sharp and we can see well through the trees, but the game is never frozen, the character is always swaying, and some objects are in motion, so we're going to see those jagged lines in motion too. I am curious, which can you best see through the trees now? This is where players generally disagree. The reason I'm against the blur effect is because it obstructs your vision if you pay attention to the fence here. In case you missed it, here it is again in slow motion. Watch closely how much more difficult it is to see through the fence on Filmic. Taking a look at it all together with trees and moving about, and it may make the decision easy for some of you. However, there is another solution here that few have discovered and kind of changes all of this. And that's the fact you can tune out some of the blur using the NVIDIA control panel sharpness setting or the sharpness setting on your physical monitor. Trust me, the results may surprise you. Let's see what this looks like if we apply a little sharpness setting to the Filmic T2X setting. We may disagree on which combination looks best, but I think we can agree that the blur is noticeable on 2x and T2X, and increasing the sharpness setting does reduce the amount of blur. Our monitors are not identical and don't have the exact same sharpness, so we don't see the exact same thing here. So my recommendation is picking the one where flickering doesn't bother you, and then if needed, increase the sharpness setting until the blur doesn't bother you either. I believe for most people this will be the regular 2x, and it may require just a tad bit of sharpness, about 5 to 10%, to really tune it in real nice. Even without dialing it in, this 2x will still likely look the best, at least on modern monitors. Performance impact isn't huge, so if the flickering on 1x really doesn't bother you, you could save a couple of meager frames here. Next up, depth of field is another clever way to improve the game by blurring it. The depth of field blur effect only happens when you scope in. I like it, and it makes sense since the eyes are focused in the center of the screen anyway. However, what I don't like is the noise created around the edges of whatever is out of focus, particularly in the scope where you need to be able to see as clearly as possible. As much as depth of field does add some realism to the game, it does it at the cost of reducing our ability to see enemies in a competitive game, so this one's gonna have to be disabled. Up next, Filmic Strength. This setting does actually work. This setting removes visual noise. It's designed to work in conjunction with anti-aliasing. The simplest way to explain this is by comparing anti-aliasing versus Filmic Strength. On Filmic, you really notice the ability of Filmic Strength to remove a lot of visual noise. On regular SMAA, it's hard to notice this effect, but it is still there. And on disabled and SMAA 1X, it has no effect. The performance numbers aren't really accurate here since I can't record this many clips long enough without something happening or somebody shooting me in Warzone. So we're gonna go ahead and do this test in a practice match to average out each clip over an entire minute for accuracy. Results are pretty straightforward. Filmic Strength has no significant impact with anti-aliasing disabled or on 1X. Barely a 1% hit on SMAA T2X and up to a 3% FPS drop on Filmic T2X. Alright, enough spider vision. Recommendation here will be setting Filmic Strength to 1 because it only affects your FPS in scenarios where there is visual noise being reduced, and removing that noise does improve sight. Also, it won't affect players running lower anti-aliasing. Setting it to 1 will serve all players properly. Getting back to settings that blur your game, we have World Motion Blur. The faster you move, the more it blurs your vision. Freeze frames of the effect reveal that it can completely blur out something of importance. The game does feel a little smoother, and that might be nice when you have a system with a low frame rate, but it just feels smoother. In reality, it really isn't. There is a performance impact of 1% indoors and the same outdoors. But here's the thing, what's the point of a low response time monitor if you're going to blur the game? Recommendation will be disabled because it impairs our vision. In case you really can't get enough of blur, there is also weapon motion blur. This setting makes it so that the faster your weapon is moving, the more blurry it is. It's not quite as easily noticeable as the previous setting. It's likely most noticeable when scoping in a gun. Performance impact is below 1%, and the recommendation will also be disabled since there's really nothing to gain from making things blurry. And last is film grain, which adds grain noise as a way to mask the imperfections we see. But since it only works on the menu screen of Warzone, it has no real use. As Party McFly here will tell you, it does absolutely nothing in an actual battle royale. It doesn't work. The only thing of interest here would be the gas price. The performance impact is also nothing, and these toilets look just as spectacular on all percentages of grain. So the recommendation will be disabled because, well, that's what it is, disabled in game. If you enjoyed and learned something with me, then please hit the like and sub buttons. If you didn't, then you will in my future videos, so just hit the damn like and sub button anyway. Until next time, happy gaming.